Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. All right, so today we'll be going over 2D arrays, which are also called matrix. And did you go over this in class, Rachel? Okay, okay. So I guess we can go over these. But you went over arrays, right? With your teacher? Okay. So okay, did you come to our array webinar like a few weeks before? Okay, sounds good. So we'll get started on 2D array. So as you have learned, like arrays in Java are like used to store like items of like different types or same types. And two-dimensional arrays are basically the same thing, or same thing as arrays, but you basically have rows and columns in your arrays. So like a row is the a row is like the horizontal elements, and a column is like the vertical elements. So going down, and the row is going across. So this two-dimensional array can be used to store data that's like represented as like a table, like spreadsheet, or like different games like tic-tac-toe, which we'll go over later today. And yeah, so like 2D arrays are very useful in storing like different types of data. And it can be used to store data types that you can't really represent as just regular one-dimensional arrays. So let me share my screen. Actually, okay, I don't know if you can see this. Okay, so basically 2D array is like a matrix, and we have rows that go across like this, and then we have columns going down. So if you look at this matrix, we have our index right here, and they start from 0, just like our regular arrays. And I will go over initializing a little bit later. Okay. Okay. So if you look at this diagram, this is the representation of two-dimensional arrays in Java. So basically, you have an array which represent like the rows right here. So this is like your regular array. And then in your array, you have an array of array. So basically, you have an array of rows, and then each element represent a row, and then that element contains another array which represent columns. So this can be a little confusing at first, but if you go over problems, I think it'll be more clear to you. Do you have any questions up to this point? Okay, good. So if you look at this array, you basically have a 2D array that has 3 rows, so 1, 2, 3, and 7 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And basically your index is represented from 0 to 6 because we're starting at 0, not from 1. So in your AP exam, all your matrix should have, or all the columns in your matrix should have the same number of columns. So like these all have 7 columns, but it is possible to have different number of columns. So this could be like 6, this could be 5, and this could be 3, but I don't think this is tested on your AP exam. so we won't go over that. So we'll just focus on like a regular matrix. So we can go over some questions a little bit. So in this one, can you tell me which values are in the row at index 2? You can just type in the numbers. Good. So this is your first row, this is your second row, and this is your third row. But because we start our index at 0, this is 0, 1, 2. So 2, -3, -4, and -5 are index 2. Can you try this question? So click on all, or you can type in all the values in the column at index 1. Good. So -2, 5, -3. So this is column 0, and this is column 1. And then let's try just one more, this one. Click on the value at row index 2 and column index 1. Good. So this is your third row and second column, but your indexes are subtracted by 1. Good. So we will go over declaring and initializing arrays. So what you want to do is, so this is very similar to declaring a regular array, but instead you have 2 brackets now, 2 sets of brackets. So first you type in the type of the array, and then you have these 2 brackets, and then you type in the name of the variable that you want to represent your 2D array. So if you just have these declarations, and then if you try to print out ticket info, you'll get an error here, because what you have done so far is you just like declared it, but you don't actually, you never initialize your array, so you don't have anything. It's just like a name that's there. So what you want to do is first you declare the names of your 2D array like this. So this 2D array stores ints, and then this 2D array stores string. So after declaring them, what you want to do is you want to initialize them. So in order to initialize them, what you have to do is you put a keyword new, and then you put in your type of the 2D array, and this should of course match your declared type here. And then you have these 2 brackets here, and then in each of them you have numbers in them. So what these represent are, this one is the number of rows you want, and then this number is the number of columns you want. So basically in your ticket info, you have a 2D array with 2 rows and 3 columns. So this just looks like a table with 2 rows and 3 columns. And same thing for seating chart. You have a 2D array of string. Now this one has 3 elements, or three rows and 2 elements. So can you guess how many elements are in ticket info? Good. You just have to multiply those 2 numbers. Okay. Now let's look at putting in numbers into our array. So when you first create, or when you first initialize your arrays like this one, all the elements in your 2D array will be initialized to 0 for like int, for type int, and for type double. And then for type Boolean, it'll be initialized to false. And then if you have type object like string, everything in your 2D array will be initialized to null. So right now, this is initialized with 0 in all of the elements, and then this should be initialized with null for all of your elements. Now, in order to set numbers, or if you want to initialize each element in the array, what you have to do is you type in the name of your array, and then you choose a position. So this is basically what we did here when we asked you for the row index 0 and column index 2. So basically, this is your row index, and this is your column index. So in your 0, 0, you put in number 15, and then similar to all the other elements, you choose the position of the elements, and then you put in the number that you want to store in that position. And then same thing for seating chart. This one is a 2D array of string. So you have, or you can store in string. So you assign each element with like a name using like your string object. Now, if we print these 2D matrix or 2D array, you actually get something like, this is like trash value, or this is like basically the address to the variables that these are pointing to. So you can't actually just print out the whole thing by just doing, oh, print system out print ticket info, or system out print seating chart. This doesn't actually give you all the, or this won't show you all the elements in your 2D array. So what you have to do is you have to loop through the arrays, which I'll show you in a bit. Basically, what you have to do is you have to look through each and every element, and then you have to specify like which element you're looking at, and then you can print out the values stored in that array. So basically, if I just had ticket info 0, 0, I want to print out what is stored in index 0 or row 0 and column 0. So if I run this, I get 15 because in 0, 0 we plugged in 15. Now if we want to check what is stored in our seating chart, let's say I want to see what's stored in row index 1 and column index 0. That will give me Jacob, because that is what we stored here. Do you have any questions up to this point? Okay. So you can initialize your arrays like this by putting in like each like element at like specific positions, or there's like a shortcut where you can use this line of code right here, or these two. So you can only do this when you know what you want all your arrays to be. So like you have an idea of what you want to store in each of your arrays. So when you first create your array, you can just like do everything all at once. But if you want to keep changing the values, you might want to use this method where you can specify where you want to store what in each location. So if you look at this code right here, what you're doing is you're basically declaring an array of type int called ticket info, and then you just have a bracket inside of the brackets. So the outer brackets represent like your array, and then each bracket represents each row. So this, the first set of brackets, this is your first row, and then in your first row you have 25, 20, and 25. So your first column will be 25, second column will be 20, and then a third column will be 25. And then your second row, you have 25, 20, 25, same thing. Now if you look at this line of code, same thing, you have a 2D array of type string called seating info. And then in your first row, the first column, you have Jamal. And then in your first row, second column, you have Maria. And then in your second row, you have Jake and Susie. And then in your third row, you have Emma and Luke. So can you tell me what the value is at seating info row 2 or index row 2 and index column 1 by looking at this code. Okay, so basically, here I'll show you. Let me just copy and paste. So if you look at this line of code, you have a matrix. So this is row 0, row 1, and row 2. And then you have column 0, 1. So right here you have Jamal. And then in your second column, which is right here. So the first set of brackets represent your row, your first row. And then it's like these are your columns in order. And then if you look at the second row, you have Jake in your first column, and then you have Susie in your second column. And then lastly, if you look at your third set of brackets, you have Emma as your first column, and then you have Luke in your second column. If you look at this line of code, it's basically the same thing, where you have, in your first row, you have 25, 20, and then 25. And then in your second row, you have 25. Does that make more sense now? Okay. So if you look at this question, can you try to answer this one? So what is the value at seeding info 2, 1 after the code above executes? So the code is this code right here. Good. So you look at row index 2. So this is row 0, and this is row 1 and row 2. And in here, you want to look at column 1. So this is column 0 and this is column 1. So it'll be Luke. Good. That's basically what we did here. Okay, and then lastly, this is looping through a 2D array. So before, when we wanted to get a specific value from your matrix, you just had to state the name, and then you type in the position of the element you want. Now, if you want the whole array, what you can do is right here. So basically, you have, let's just use that example. You have an array right here called seeding info. And basically what you want to do is first you run through, or you loop through your rows, and then inside that you loop through your columns. So you have, you run a for loop, and then it's easier if you name your variable row to just, or it's kind of like conventional. You want to loop through rows. So starting from row 0, because our index starts at 0, and then what you can do is you can just do seeding info.length, because this is basically just an array of arrays. So this is how you would usually loop through an array. You just call the name of the array, and then you just use the method .length. And then in this for loop, you can do another for loop, so nested for loop. For your conditionals, you want to do column is less than seating info at 0.length, because remember, if we go back to this diagram right here, each of the elements in your row contains an array of column. So basically, if you look at when you do oh no, whoops, okay, let me just do that again. Sorry. Looking at this part right here, and then you just call the length of that. So that will be just the length of your column. And what you want to do is you can just sim out print your seating at row and current. Then I guess I can do this. And then after each column, I can an extra line to distinguish each row. Okay, so this is how you look through every element in the array. So what you do is you just basically look through your rows. So at row 0, currently your row is 0, and then you look at your column, and your column is 0. So you print 0, 0, which is Jamal. And then you increase column by 1. So you print your element at row 0 and column 1, which is Maria. And then at the end of this for loop, you bring out an extra line, and then your row becomes 1. And then you do this in a process where you print out each columns in this row, and then print out all the columns in the next row. So this is your output. Okay, thanks, Jack. Okay, so that is all I have for the basic contents for the 2D arrays, and I'll pass it on to Jack, and she will go over a problem with you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming out tonight. So today we're going to try to show you another fun way where you can implement 2D arrays. So I don't know if you were here for the first array lecture, but we kind of went over a little bit of cryptology and how you can use arrays to encode and decode messages which you can send to your friends. But for today's example, we're going to try to program tic-tac-toe. So what we're going to do is, let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Can everyone see this code tic-tac-toe right here?
Yep, you can see it.
Okay, cool. Let me go like this so I can see your comments. So what's already in here is just a little bit of background on reading in from the keyboard, so that way we can get the user's input. Just in case not everyone's covered it, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I just put it in here to start, as well as initializing our board, just in case, so we all can have fun with this example, even though we might come from different backgrounds. Okay, so the first thing we're going to write today is we're going to write the print board method. So I know we covered methods briefly before, but again, just to review, the first keyword is public, and then static, and then void. And these are typical things you'll use to start off your method. We'll go into what these keywords mean more specifically when we go into our methods lecture or our webinar. And then what we passed in is the board, which we can access. But in this method, we don't necessarily know that our board is a 3x3. We do because we wrote the program, but we're going to need to make sure we use our keywords that Seven went over when accessing the length and how many rows and columns the board has. So does anyone remember what type of loop we'll use to go through and print the board? Any ideas? Yeah. Nice job. So yeah, we're going to use a for loop here. And what's neat about for loops is your variable here doesn't always have to be I, but rather you can change what it's called. So for going through all of our rows, we're going to call this int row, just to make it easier to keep track of. And we're going to, again, start that at 0, because that's where our indexing starts. And then the next thing is what's our stopping condition? So does anyone know what our stopping condition for this one is? I'll give you a hint. When row is less than what? Does anyone know how to find the number of rows in the board? Any ideas? Okay, so for this one, I don't know if you guys remember, but Seven went over it. To find the number of rows on the board, we're just going to do board.length. One way to think of two-dimensional arrays is it's an array of arrays. So to find the number of rows, that's just board.length. And that will give you kind of the length of the array holding all the other arrays. And then again, we want to go through all our rows. So we're going to do row plus plus. And then we also need a way to go through all of our columns. So again, we're going to use a for loop here, and we can call this columns to make sure we keep track of it better. We're going to start at 0 because we want to go through all of our columns, and that's where our indexing starts. But now we need to make sure we include the number of columns. Does anyone have an idea as to what we would place in type next to get the total number of columns that the board has? Feel free to type your answers in the group chat on the side of the screen. Okay, so to find the number of columns in a board, we can always do board 0 or board row dot length. So the reason why I used row here instead of 0 is like because our matrix or our 2D array, all the rows have the same number of columns. Putting any of the numbers 0, 1, or 2 would work here. However, sometimes you might find yourself in the situation where not all of the rows have the same number of columns. So, and because we want to think of matrices or 2D arrays as arrays of arrays, we can just add row here. But if we put 0 here, this would work just as easily. And then again, we want to go through all of our columns, so we'll do column plus plus. And then while we're here, we want to print out the contents of the array itself. So we can just go ahead and type board and then access the row in its specific spot and column in its specific spot. And then we'll do plus a space. Give us some nice formatting. Another thing we'll want to do is we will want to make sure we separate all of our rows from our columns. So after this for loop runs, before going to the next row, we're going to want to print out a blank line. So here this should go through and print our whole board very nicely. We can go ahead and we can run that just to be safe. So let's comment everything else out and just print our board. I'll just comment out this whole while loop. Print board. And then we can see down here at the bottom. Let it run. That we have these blank characters, since right now there are no characters in our board. So this is what your tic-tac-toe board would look like before you started playing. Once we start to add values in it, that's when we'll see our X's and O's that you would expect with tic-tac-toe. So let's go ahead and try to plug those in. Today we're not going to be too concerned about finding out who won and who lost, because we will be a little short on time, but really trying to make sure we know how to edit the values of the array. So with the code is written for you, it will get the input and store it as row and column. And we just need to add some code to update the board to include an X in the player selection. Does anyone have any ideas as to what line of code can help us do that? Again, our board is just called board, and we're given the row and the column that the user wants to put an X at, and we need to change it to an X itself. No one has an idea? Okay, does anyone know what comes first? We're going to be changing the values of our board, but what should come first, our rows or our columns here? Good job. So yeah, we'll just insert our board row, followed by our column. And because this is a char array, we're going to change this just their selection to char X. And then later on, we're going to ask for the person who's playing the O's for their input. And we are going to do the same thing here. So board, row, column. Except for this time, we're going to mark this player selection as an O. And then after each person goes, we're going to print the board and prompt the next player for their turn. So we can go ahead and test our code out over here. So Rachel, do you want to be X's? Where would you like to move in tic-tac-toe? Keep in mind that our indexes start at 0 when you're making your moves. One. So you want to go in the center square? Awesome. And then you'll see that's exactly where the mark is made. How about you, Shreya? If you were playing this game of tic-tac-toe, where would you want to go? Two, three. Oh, just remember, our indexes with two-dimensional arrays and one-dimensional arrays always starts at 0. So 2, 3 would not be a valid command because the 3 would actually fall outside of the array. So if we were to type that, we would get an out-of-bounds exception. 1, 2. Okay, awesome. Oops. So then you go right next to her. What about you, mini violin gal? If you're now X's, where would you like to make your move given the board? Zero, zero, so upper corner. And you'll see that's where the move is made. And Rachel, if you wanted to block the 2 X's as the O player, where should you go? Nice job. Up, and let's just let the O's win this one. So we're going to put in a bogus value for the X's. And then Shreya, if you wanted to win this game as the O's, where should your final move be? Zero, 2. Yep, that's exactly right. And as you can see, now the O's have won this game. They have 3 in a row. Something cool of a game you can make yourself, even with like just taking 1 or 2 computer science courses, you can learn how to program cool games like tic-tac-toe. So yeah, that's the end of my part of today's lecture. And I'm going to pass it back over to Hannah, who's going to take you through some practice questions.
Okay, guys, so now we are going to do some practice questions to test your guys' knowledge. So I'm going to send you guys the link to them. Give me a second. Okay, so the link to them is in the chat, and we're running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to give you guys about 10 minutes to try to do both questions, and then we'll go over them. All right, I'll wait a couple more minutes to give you guys a little bit more time. All right, guys, I know that not everybody is done, but we are going to start going over the questions since we are a little bit short on time. So for the first question, it's asking you to look at a piece of code and then it wants to know the contents of the array after the code has finished executing. So for questions like these, it is very helpful to actually trace out each variable on your paper and actually draw everything out. So I'm going to show you guys how I would do this problem on a whiteboard if I were to get this on the AP test. So the first thing that I would do is it might help you guys to actually visualize the array if you draw what it would look like. So for this question, it would be 3, 2, 1, and then 1, 2, 3. So this is what our, can you guys see this okay? Yep, you guys can see it. Okay, cool. So this is what our initial array would look like. I have the indexes of the rows and the columns on the side, and then we have our first row and our second row of the array. So then if we go into the code, the first thing that we have is a for loop. And so I would also keep track of that variable in the for loop. So we have the variable row starting out at 1. And then if you look at the next for loop, we have another variable call that is also starting out at 1. So I would just write those on my paper to really try to keep track of what is happening each time we go through the loop. So then the first line of code in the inner for loop is asking if the array at those certain indexes mod 2 is equal to 1. So we have here what row and column are currently equal to. So we want to look at array at the element position of the first row and at the first column. So with our drawn array, that is very easy to find. So we see that it is going to be this number over here, this 2. And so this question is a little bit tricky because you have to remember that array indexing for 2D arrays or one-dimensional arrays always starts at 0 and not 1. So that is something that I think some of you guys have been tripped up on for this question. So it's really important to look where your for loops are starting at. In this case, it is at 1 and not at 0. So although it might logically make more sense if we wanted to go through this whole array to start at the elements at the 0th index, this question is asking us to look at the element at the first index instead. So if we look at that, that number is 2. And so then that first line of code is asking us, is 2 mod 2 equal to 1? And so modulus division is just looking at the remainder. So 2 mod 2 is going to be equal to 0, not equal to 1. So we are going to skip that if statement and move to the second if statement. And so now this if statement is asking us, is 2 mod 2 equal to 0? And it is. So we are going to go into that if statement, and it looks like we want to update that element to be equal to 2 times itself. So now that 2 is going to become a 4. I'm sorry, my marker does not erase very well, but I'll try to make it a little bit darker. But that is supposed to be a 4. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. So now we're going to go back up to our inner for loop, and we need to update our variable. And so now column is going to be equal to 2. And so we are going to go back into the loop because if we look at our condition, it wants to see if column is less than the length of the columns of the array, not the rows of the array. So even though there are only 2 rows, we do have 3 columns, so that inner for loop is still going to run that one more time. So we have call equal to 2. We're going to go into our for loop again. And so we go back to that if statement, and now we need to check the element at our array at the first row and the second column. So we are going to look at this element right here, this 3. And so we are going to first check to see if 3 mod 2 is equal to 1, and this time that statement is true. So we go into that if statement, and now we want to update that value to be equal to 1 plus its current value. So now this is going to be equal to 4. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, so now we keep going, and we're going to look at that second if statement, and we are still on that same element, and we need to see if that mod 2 is equal to 0. And this is another thing that can trip you up. This actually tripped me up when I was first doing this problem, and I went back and I looked at it again. It's important to make sure, even though you go through this if statement and you see that this the first if statement was true, since we updated this element, now the second if statement is also going to be true because 4 mod 2 is equal to 0. So this element is no longer 3, which if it was 3, that second if statement would not be true. But since we updated it to be 4, that second if statement is now going to also be true. So it's important to, like I said, really keep track of everything that you are doing. So that second if statement is true now, so we go into that. And now we are going to update this element to be multiplied by 2, which is going to be 8. So now we have this second row looking like 1, 4, 8. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. And if you guys ever have any questions about like anything I've previously done, you can also type that in the chat. So now we're going to go back up to that inner for loop. We update call to be equal to 3. And now that is greater than the number of columns. So now we're going to go back up to that outer for loop and we update row to be 2. And the value of array.length is equal to 2 because we have our 2 rows. So now that loop is going to be done also. And so at the final execution of our code, our values are going to be 3, 2, 1, 1, 4, 8. So the correct answer would be the third answer. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so now let's go over the second question. So the second question wants you guys to write a function that prints out the sum of each row and column in a 2D array. So I'm going to show you guys how I did this problem. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see my Eclipse? Okay, so this is how I solved this problem. So I have a function that I called SumArray that takes in a 2D integer array called R. And if you guys have not dealt with functions in class yet, we are going to be doing a whole webinar on how functions work with passing in parameters next time. But if you guys have not dealt with functions yet, basically this works. It's kind of like main, except we are going to be using this array called R that we are going to get from somewhere else in the program. But besides that, it's like any other piece of code that you guys have written before. So the first thing that I did to tackle this problem was I created an integer variable called sum that is going to hold the sum of each row and each column. So the first thing that I wanted to do was get the sum of each of the rows. So I just had a line printing row sums. And then to do this, we are going to have two for loops that go through the whole 2D array. And so we have our outer for loop that is going to go through all of the rows. So we are starting it at 0, and it's going to go to be less than the length of our array. And then I is going to increment by 1 each time. And so that's going to go through each value of our rows. And then for each time that we get to a new row, we have this inner for loop that's going to go through all of our columns. So I just created another variable called j, and j is going to go through the length of each column. And each time we get to a new value in the array as we're going through each row, we're going to add 1 to the sum. And so since we're only summing each row, we're not summing the whole array, we need to make sure that each time we go through this inner for loop, we start the sum back at 0 each time, so it doesn't just add up the whole array. And then after we go through each of the rows each time, we're just going to print out what sum is equal to at that point. Does that make sense to you guys so far? Or is there anything that I could explain better for just that first part? Okay. So then we move on to the columns. And so for the column sum, we're basically going to do the same thing, except we're going to flip-flop the rows and the columns. So this time, since we want to sum each column, our columns are going to be the outer for loop. So we're going to create another integer named I, and I, instead of going like in this first one to be less than array.length, we want it to be less than the length of all of our columns. And so that's why for this one, we're going to do r and then 0 and then length. And then we're going to increment I by 1 each time. And so just like with our rows, each time we go through one, we're going to start the sum back at 0. And then in our inner for loop, we're going to go through each of the row positions in that current column, and we are going to add to sum the value of the element in our current position in the array, and we are going to print out that value, the sum value, after we finish going through each column. So if we run this, I just created at the top here an integer array equal to what we had in our example. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we pass that into our function, which, like I said, if this doesn't make exact sense to you guys right now, we're going to have a whole webinar on functions very soon. But so then we go into our function with array, and it's going to come out looking like this. So does that make sense to everyone? Or does anyone have any questions about how I went about this? Just something that should come into your guys' head when you're taking the test. Whenever you see an array or a 2D array and you need to get the values of most of or all of the elements, you should immediately think loops. So for arrays, just doing one loop to go through it. And for 2D arrays, it's usually going to be a nested for loop to go through all of the values. So does that make sense, everyone? I'll just wait another minute in case any of you are typing out questions. Okay, great, Shreya. Yeah, the important thing to remember is sometimes with all these loops and all the array accessing, it can get a little bit confusing. And so really just practicing these problems and tracing everything out will really help you guys to better understand how to tackle them. But so I think that is it for today. If you guys have any other questions about 2D arrays or anything that you've learned so far, you can always sign up for one-on-one tutoring sessions, and we will be back on Sunday with a new topic. So I hope you guys have a good rest of the week. Bye. And Jack just posted the one-on-one times in the Google chat if you guys want to sign up for that. Thanks, Jack. All right, bye guys.